Hello, everyone. This is Lloyd Hall. I'm a Messianic minister. Um, this video and these types of videos are going to be based on breaking down the walls. Now, what that means is that all the understandings that are out there floating around, regardless of what denomination that they're from or wherever they may have came from, we're going to go ahead and look at what the Father's Word actually says about these topics. And we are going to dissolve these understandings into one understanding, one biblical understanding. Okay, now these are topical videos. So the topic today will be on what it means to be grafted in, or in other words, what it means to be a part of something that you were not originally a part of. Okay, um, we're going to be looking at Romans chapter 11, 13 through 24. I'm sorry I do not have my glasses on because they cause a glare. Um, so sometimes I need to be able to look a little bit closely to what I'm looking at. Um, so we're going to go ahead and read Romans 11, 13 through 24. Then we're going to go ahead and break it all down. We're going to use the rest of the Father's Word to answer what Paul's talking about. Because Paul did not just come by all this just out of thin air. Okay? He learned it from the Old Testament because the Old Testament actually talks about it. Let me take that shadow out. Okay? Um, so we're going to look at what the Father, the Creator, talks about what it means to be grafted in, and where Paul has received this information from the Spirit and what it all means and how it all ties together. Okay? So what we're going to do is take this understanding of men, this doctrine, and we're going to destroy it, in a sense that we're going to rebuild it. Okay? This is like the temple in Jerusalem, where it was destroyed and it was rebuilt even more beautiful than it was before. Okay? So that's what we're going to do on these videos. So this is Breaking Down the Wall. This is a new series, and we're going to go ahead and start with the reading. Okay? Now, Romans 11, chapter 11, verse 13, I'm going to be reading this out of the King James Version first, and then I'm going to read it out of the Sefer Bible, which is more of a Messianic Paleo-Hebrew type Bible, which goes back further than what you would say the Greek form or the Aramaic form. It's more based off of Hebrew understanding. So we're going to go ahead and just read Romans 11, 13 through 24 in both books. Then we're going to go ahead and start breaking this down. Okay. So it says, this is a warning to the Gentiles. Okay. To the believers who are not Jewish, who have become believers. Okay. It is a warning. And these are the reasons why it's a warning as we read it. It says, for I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I, meaning Paul, am the apostle to the Gentiles, or of the Gentiles. I magnify my office. Okay? If by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are my flesh, meaning that Paul was a Jew. Okay? So he's trying to provoke his brothers and sisters into understanding what is being taken place. Okay? And it says, and might save some of them. Okay? So through this doctrine that he's talking about, he is hoping that he saves some of his own people. Okay? So For if the casting away of them, meaning the Jews or Israel, be the reconciling of the world, what will the receiving of them be but life from dead, or life from the dead? For if the fruit or first fruits be holy, the lump is also holy, and if the root is holy, so are the branches. And if some of the branches are broken off, and you, Gentiles, believers who are not Jews, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, meaning the Jews, or in this case, Messianics who actually believe in the Messiah, and with them partaking of the root, which the root is the Jewish culture and so on and so forth. That's where all this understanding comes from. And fatness of the olive tree. The olive tree that it's respectively talking about is that Israel is known throughout the Bible as the olive tree. Okay. We will also go over that as well as we break this all down. So then he says, here comes the warnings. It says, boast not against the branches, meaning you Gentiles, don't boast against those branches that were taken out. Don't boast against the branches that are still in. But if you do boast, you do not bear the root, but the root bears you. Okay? So what that means is you are not over or higher than the root who feeds you or who should be feeding you. Okay? Now, since the root comes from Jewish culture and Jewish understanding, and you boast against it, and you cut yourself off from it, then you're not gaining the nutrients that you need from the root, and therefore your branch dies off. So this is what Paul continues to say. He says, you will say then, the branches were broken off, meaning the Jewish branches that were broken off that were unbelievers, that I might be grafted in. Now thinking, and this is the teaching, that since those branches are taken out, that they have no more place in the Father's covenant. That's not the case, because if you continue reading, it'll explain what this means. Okay? And it says, well, because of unbelief, they were broken off. So for the Jews who did not believe, they were taken out. But the Jews who did believe, they were still in on the tree as a branch. Okay? So, and you standing by faith, meaning you Gentiles standing by faith, be not high-minded, but fear. Okay? Don't think yourself better than the rest of the branches or the root from which you are connected to, but fear. And it says here, fear, and Paul breaks it down in verse 21. For if God, or Yahuwah, which is his name in the Paleo-Hebrew, spared not the natural branches, meaning he did not spare the natural unbelieving branches, but take heed lest he also not spare you. Okay? So you need to listen and pay attention. Okay? You cannot groan against the root from which you are connected to. You cannot groan or boast against the branches that you're connected to. Okay? If you continue to do so, there is a chance, and it's not even saying this chance, it says Don't do it, because if you do, you might not be spared either. So stop boasting against the branches. Stop boasting or railing or grieving against the root from which you're attached to. So it goes on and it says, verse 22, behold, therefore the goodness and severity of God. Okay, everything that the Father does is good. God is good all the time. All the time, God is good. Okay, and the severity of God. Okay, the way that he sees sin is an abomination to him. So therefore, it must be cut off and thrown away into the fire. Okay, but as we read, he doesn't literally cut off and throw into the fire until a certain time. Okay, so the severity of God in this case was that he took the unbelievers and cut them off and grafted in those who will believe, which means the Gentiles or those who are not Jews. But towards you, goodness. So he was severe against those that he took out. But towards you, who he put in, he has done goodness. Okay? If you continue in his goodness, okay, that means if you continue in his word, if you continue to practice, if you continue to be a child of God by the actions of your faith, okay, you cannot be good and not obey the Father's word. You can't. To be good in the Father's eye means to obey. Okay? Even the Messiah talks about it. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. Okay? Then we need to understand what his commandments are. Where did his commandments come from? What did he know at his point in time, knowing the fact that the New Testament wasn't even close to being written while he was alive? There was only one book or books that he had to go to for all this understanding and all this wisdom and all this guidance and everything that he taught. And he also taught his disciples to teach the same, which we will also go over in the Gospels. So, if you go ahead and cut yourself off from the richness of the teachings of the Messiah, from how he taught, then you're cutting yourself off from the olive tree in which you were grafted into, and you're cutting yourself off from the root that gives you your nourishment. So it continues to go on, and it says, otherwise, you also will be cut off. So if you continue to do good, you will continue to be a branch upon the tree. If you continue to obey the Father's word, if you continue to abide by the example and teachings of the Messiah, okay, then if you don't, you are likely to be cut off. Okay, then this is what it says in verse 23. And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, meaning that those who had unbelief start to believe, will be grafted in. Okay, so this is a process. Those who already believe of the Jewish community or the Israelite community or the Hebrew community, whatever you want to call it, those who already believe are already still part of the tree. But those who are taken out with unbelief, as they believe, they are grafted in. Okay, this is what Paul's talking about. And it says, will be grafted in. God is able to graft them in. Okay, so You have nothing to do with it. You have no say in what God's doing with his understanding or his plans. Okay? So to sit here and talk about, because of these man's understanding of the Father's word, and sit here and talk about that, oh, the Jews are no longer allowed. Okay, all the stuff in the Old Testament is no longer allowed. Okay, we're going to go over that too in another video, part of this series, called Breaking Down the Walls. Okay, um, but for now, we're just talking specifically about being grafted in, what that means. Okay, and it goes on to the last verse. For if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, okay, the Father sees you as wild by nature. Okay, wild by nature in this sense means sinful. Okay, because you work on your own will and not his will. You are wild. You are lawless. This is how he sees you before you have come into the Messiah. Okay, so you were a part of a wild olive tree. And it says, and were grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree. So you've taken from a wild olive tree that doesn't grow correctly, meaning it doesn't show the fruit that it's supposed to show on season when it's supposed to show it, but are grafted into a good olive tree that actually does produce fruit and actually does produce that fruit each season. So this is what you're grafted into. This is what it talks about when Paul states about the first fruit being holy. And the lump is also holy. Okay? So then going on. So if you, and were grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more will these, meaning those he took out, which be the natural branches, which means they naturally belong to that tree, be grafted into their own olive tree? So going along these understandings that are being thrown around, one understanding is that the Jews are no longer allowed in the Father's covenant due to the Messiah, that the Messiah has somehow just cut them off. Another understanding is that the olive tree that you're connected to is the Messiah specifically. Okay, that you were once bad, now you're good. Okay, that's not that. That's not even close. All right, because we're going to go through the Old Testament and find out what it means to be grafted in. Okay, you're not grafted into the Messiah. You're grafted into the culture and the promises that were given to the Jews, as we should be reading here in just a little bit. Now I'm going to go ahead and read from the Sefer. The other understandings, we're going to go over those understandings too throughout this video, once they come about in my memory. So we're going to go ahead and read the Sefer Bible, which Sefer just means book or words. And we're going to read from Romans chapter 11, 13 through 24 again. Now, this is going to put it in a little bit more simpler terms and a better translation according to the King James Version. You have all those shouts and wilts and so on and so forth, which makes it hard to understand if you do not understand what those shouts and wilts, knots, and so on and so forth means. So we're going to go ahead and read something a little bit more simpler. So Romans 11:13 states, "For I speak to you, other nations, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the other people, I magnify my office. you other nations are anybody that is not Israel. Inasmuch as I am the apostle of the other people. Okay? Claiming that he is an apostle to those nations. If by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are my flesh, and might save some of them. Okay? Like I said before, his hope is to save some of his people by this doctrine. For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, meaning because they were cast away, that the rest of the world may be reconciled to God. What will the receiving of them be but life from the dead? Just like we are buried in the Messiah, we also arise from the dead. This is what he's speaking about when he's talking about that. For if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root be holy, so is the branches. And if some of the branches are broken off, and you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them partake of the root and fatness of the olive tree, boast not against the branches. But if you boast, you bear not the root, but the root bears you. You will say then, the branches were broken off, that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off. And you stand by belief. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if Yah spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not you. Meaning, be careful, or he may not spare you. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of Yah on them which fell, severity. But towards you, goodness, if you continue in his goodness. That's a huge if. If you continue in his goodness, you will continue to be a branch upon this tree and upon the root in which you're gaining nourishment. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, meaning that they are no longer unbelievers, but now believers, will be grafted in, for Yah is able to graft them in again, meaning that he has the power and authority to do it, not Christianity, not understandings of men, not the Roman Catholic Church. Only God has the authority to build up kings, to take kings down, to build up nations, or destroy them. Only the Father has these powers. For if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more will these, which be the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? Now, that concludes the actual reading portion of those verses. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to find out what these connection verses are so that we can dig deeper down into the understanding of what is being actually said here. Okay? Because if you just take these words specifically, which should be extremely clear to you, but because of men have twisted the understanding of these words, you get things like, oh, the Jews are done. And you get things like, I don't have to abide by anything the root says or anything the root does, or its culture or its people. I don't have anything to do with that. Nowhere in those verses does it say that. Nowhere. In fact, it tells you to abide in the root so that you may live. That's what it's talking about in these verses. It's not talking about you getting rid of the root so that you can be a branch all by yourself. Because I will tell you this much. If you cut down a tree, the branches on that tree, and that tree, once it is destroyed from that root, that tree will die. That is just a fact. That's how grafting in works. If you cut a branch off, that branch dies. If you graft another branch in, that branch lives. But it lives off the root. It lives off the nutrients of the root. If it didn't live off the nutrients of the root, it also would die. So we're going to go ahead and look at some of these connection verses. Starting with actually, we're going to have to go through some of these verses because not all connection verses that it talks about in the study Bible are actually connection verses. Okay. So we're going to look at 17, and it says, and if some of the branches be broken off. Okay. So it tells us to go to Jeremiah 11:16. So we're going to go to Jeremiah chapter 11, verse 16, and see what Jeremiah says, or what the Father Spirit says to Jeremiah. And it says, the Lord called your name a green olive tree, fair and of goodly fruit. With the noise of a great tumult, he has kindled fire upon you, or upon it, and the branches of it are broken. This is what it's talking about breaking off those branches. Okay? And it says some of the branches be broken off. Jeremiah explains how that process actually happened, how the branches were actually broken off by fire and a great tumult, which means there was problems that arose either within the nation or nations coming against the nation. A tumult is something like war, something like civil unrest, things like that. Those are tumults. Okay. So with the noise of great tumult would probably be war. And he has kindled fire upon it, and the branches of it are broken. So this is a battle against principalities, against spirits in high and heavenly places. Okay. This is why we need to have a concept or biblical understanding or foundation off of what the Father's word strictly says, not by what we're being taught by another man, because men are fallible, which means men are accustomed to being wrong. Okay? Because the flesh itself is sin, as the Bible talks about. Okay? Every man is a liar. Every man is a liar if he speaks on his own accord. But you cannot lie when you're sitting here just reading what the Father's word is actually saying. So everything that I've said so far about the passages that we read, and the understanding that I've gained from it, we are going to go through those and see what the Father's word actually says about it, and see if I'm correct or not. Okay? Or see if the understanding that Christianity holds is correct or not. God always speaks the truth. Every man is a liar. Period. You need to remember that. If it's the last thing you remember, every man is a liar, and only the Father speaks the truth. So who are you going to run to when you want to hear the truth? You're going to run to church and run to a man who's sitting up in a pulpit. You're going to run to your friends. You're going to run to your family members and ask them about what God thinks about something. No, he gave us his word so we can come directly to him. He wants you to come to him. He's the only one who has the truth. That's why the Bible was written. So you can seek him out whenever you have a question. So going on, it also tells us to go to John 15:2. So we're going to go to John 15:2 and see what John says in his gospel. This is actually specifically the Messiah speaking. So we're actually going to read chapter 15:1 through 17. So this is what the roots and everything are based off of. This is what the tree is also based off of. This is what the Gentile believers, Jewish believers in the Messiah are to follow. So it states in chapter 15, I'm going to read from the King James Version for all these connection verses. So John chapter 15, verse 1, it says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. Meaning the Father is the one who grafts and ungrafts. He's the one who tends to the tree. He's the one who gives it water in its season. He's the one who gives it the nutrients from the ground. He is the one who tends the olive tree. And the Messiah is the true vine. Okay? Now, in all actuality, it should say vein, because of a vein of a tree and the veins that come from the root. Okay? So, in all, essentially, the Messiah is actually the roots. This is what he's saying. I am the true vine. Because there are no vines on a tree unless they come off of something else and attach itself to the tree. And this is not what the Messiah is saying. He's saying, I am the true vine. I am the root. And the Father is the husbandman, or the one who takes care of the tree. Every branch in me that bears not fruit, he takes away. Those who have unbelief are taken away. And every branch that bears fruit, he purges it, or prunes it, or in other words, tends to it, cares for it. That's what you do when you prune something. You take away all the little dead pieces, okay, and you leave what's left that is alive, so the whole entire tree can flourish. And in this case, it's a wild olive tree, so all the fruits of the olive can actually flourish upon the tree, and not just on parts of the tree, but the whole tree. So it goes on and says, now you, and purchase it, that it may bring forth more fruit. Okay? If there's still dead pieces on the tree, it's hard for that tree to actually grow the amount of fruit that it actually could grow, because parts of it is dead. So he prunes it and makes sure that the tree can grow at its max amount. Now you are clean through the word which I have spoken unto you. So it is the word, the Father's word, the Bible, that makes you clean. Okay? So if you go ahead and say, take one part of it and leave out the other part, if you rely on the branches only and you don't rely on the root, do you see there might be something wrong with that? But he says you are clean through the word which I have spoken unto you. So it's through his teachings, the words of his teachings that he's spoken to you, that makes you clean. Where did those words come from? They didn't come from the New Testament. New Testament wasn't around at the time. They came from the Old Testament. Those words that he spoke, those words that he taught, and so on and so forth. Those are the words that he spoke to you. Those are, in other words, those are the words he spoke to his disciples. And those words his disciples spoke to their disciples, and so on and so forth. Then he says in verse 4, abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear of itself, you cannot live separated on your own upon the tree. This is what he's saying. Abide in me, meaning the root of the tree, and I in you. And the root will abide in you, meaning give you your nourishment when you need it. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, meaning you cannot gain your own nutrients by yourself. You have to go back to the root. Except it abide in the vine. It's what I was just talking about. The vine being the root. Okay? This just means that the translation is not completely correct, because it should literally say root. But the understanding of a tree is that the only vine on a tree is its root, because they look like vines. They stem out from the bottom of the tree to grab all the nutrients it possibly can in the area. So no more can you except you abide in me. So your branch will not survive if you do not gain the nutrients from the root. And it's exactly the same as abiding in him. So if we don't abide in the root, then we're not abiding in him. This is what he says. No more can you except you abide in me. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself except it abide in the vine. He is comparing him to the root and the branches to you. I am the vine, or the root. You are the branches. So he's saying, I am the root, you are the branches. He that abides in me means that he who abides in the root, and I in him, meaning you gain the nutrients from that root. The same brings forth much fruit, which means you will not only just live, you will thrive. For without me, you can do nothing. Without me, you can do nothing. Without the root from which you are connected to, you can do nothing. Where's your doctrine at now? The Messiah just completely destroyed it. If you don't believe so, we're going to continue reading. So, he says in verse 6, in John chapter 15, if a man abide not in me, he is cast forth as a branch, and is withered, and men gather them, and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. So if you do not abide in the root, he says what he's going to do to those branches, and he says he's going to cut them off, and he's going to, once they're cut off, they're going to die, and once they're dead, they're going to be thrown into the fire, and they're going to be burned. If you continue, this is the warning, if you continue to cut yourself off from the root, which the Messiah taught through the Old Testament, you will too be cut off. You too will wither. You too will be gathered and cast into the fire. Please understand what's being said here. These are not the words of men. This is the word of the Messiah. This is the word of the Father's holy book. Understand it. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you. If you abide in the root, and the words of the root abide in you, which is the nutrients of the root, you will ask what you will, and it will be done to you. If you follow and obey the Father's word, he will do everything and anything that you ask him to. Every question you have, he will answer. Every door that you need open, he will open. Herein is my Father's glory. Herein is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit. The Father's glory is in that you actually bear fruit, and not just some fruit, but much fruit, that you thrive. Okay? So shall you be my disciples. And by partaking of the root and being able to thrive because of that root, he is calling you disciples. So shall you be my disciples. Sorry. So going on and reading verse 9. And it says, as the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Meaning, he did not spare the rod of correction. Okay? Those I love, I chastise. If I did not love you, I would not rebuke you. I would not correct you. I would not come to you and bring you back to right standing with God. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Continue you in my love. And this is what it talks about, what his love is in the next verse. If you keep my commandments, whose commandments are they? If the Messiah is the Word of God made flesh, which the Word of God at the time was the complete whole Old Testament. So, if he is the complete words of the Old Testament, then when he says my commandment or my commandments, he's talking about the Old Testament in which he lives. As a Jew, he had to abide by all the Old Testament. So he says, as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Continue you in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love. If you keep his commandments, then you will abide in his love. Meaning you will be able to gain the nourishment from the roots. Okay? And then your fruit will be able to thrive upon the tree. You shall or will abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, even as I have kept my Father's commandments. Okay? So this is where he makes the connection that his commandments are his Father's commandments. So let's go ahead and just read that. If you keep my commandments, I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. So this is how he's saying it works. He's saying, I fulfilled and I completed all of the Old Testament as the Father called me to. I obeyed his commandments, meaning I abided in his commandments. Okay? Those commandments become who you are. So then they're no longer just the Father's commandments. They're also your commandments. And this is why he states, if you keep my commandments. So, if you go ahead, like I just took a drink. Now, that drink is a drink all by itself, okay, without me. But if I take the drink, it becomes a part of me, and I gain nourishment from it. So, from that nourishment, I'm able to, this body is able to thrive, live or grow or do whatever. So, it is the same aspect as in, if you take something, like say, if you love music, and you take just one certain type of music, that music starts to become who you are. Your understanding, the way that you feel things, and so on and so forth. Okay, whatever you immerse yourself in, that's what you become. Okay, that's the understanding and the nourishment you get from those things. This is what it's talking about. So going on, reading verse 11, these things have I spoken to you, that my joy might remain in you, and that your joy might be full. Okay? If we remain in the root, and if we remain in the obedience to the Father's word, as commanded through the Messiah, then he will be joyous, and we will also be uh, extremely joyful. Okay? So then, verse 12, it says, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Okay? If we're railing against each other and we're speaking bad against the other branches, or we're speaking bad against the root, I'm not speaking bad against Christianity. I'm speaking correction to Christianity. There's a huge difference. I don't hate you. I hate the understanding, because it goes against the Father's word. This is why it states that you are to study to show yourself approved unto God. Okay, it doesn't say if you would like to study. It does not say, well, if you feel like it. Well, you can if you want to. No, it says study. Study is command word as the way it's used. It means you need to take action. You need to do what's being said. Just as it says, uh, uh, do not lie, do not steal, do not commit adultery. Do not is a command statement or command wording. Okay, you need to understand how this works. So when it says study to show yourself approved unto God, it's a command for you to do it. It is your obligation. It's not just something that you can just take on a whim. He's telling you, you have to study. It's not just reading his word. You have to dig deep. You have to study his word. So, going on, reading number 12 again. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. And 13, greater love has no man than this, that a man laid down his life for his friends. Now, considering that Christianity doesn't see, some of Christianity does not see Jews uh, as friends, or let alone brothers, um, and the Orthodox Jews, they actually do see Christianity as friends, just friends who are delusional. Okay, um, but that doesn't mean that they're not willing to be friends. Israel and America have strong ties together, even though America is a Christian nation and Israel is a Jewish nation. Okay, but I will tell you now that not everybody in Israel is an Orthodox Jew. Just like not everyone here in America is a Christian. Okay. The Messiah talks about bridging that gap. Now, this is what it means to lay down your life, to bridge that gap for that other person. Okay. A messianic specifically bridges the gap, the huge chasm that has been created between the Jewish culture and the Orthodox Jews and the Christianity in all of its denominations. The messianic believers are the ones who are in between, who follow the Messiah the way that it talks about in the Gospels, according to Christianity. And then on the other side also follows, as the rest of the Bible talks about, and even the Gospels talks about, in following the law, as the Jews do. There's not one part of the Father's word that a messianic believer does not take, use, practice, or obey. And this is why a messianic is in that gap, because they are smack dab right in between both parties. One party who only believes in the New Testament, the other party who only believes in the Old Testament. One party that only practices the New Testament, the other party only practices the Old Testament. The messianic practices all of it, because that's what the Father's word says that we're supposed to do. And that's what these videos are going to be about. The understanding of breaking down these walls and coming together as one, like we're supposed to. Like the Father's word talks to us about, we're supposed to be one as He is one. That there's one love, one Father, one Spirit, one salvation. There's not many, which means there's not many denominations, which means there's not two separate bodies within one body. Like we're talking about the grafting in. You cannot be a part of the same body, becoming one, and be cut off. You cannot cut yourself off from the rest of the body and think that you're going to survive, or let alone that the other part of that body will survive either. So going on, verse 13, it says, greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. 14, you are my friends, if you do whatsoever I command you. Okay. It's not what the disciples command. It's not what Paul commands. It's not what the Roman Catholic Church commands. It's not what the preacher at the pulpit commands. It's not what the churches of all the different denominations command. It's not what the Orthodox Jews command. It's not what your brothers, sisters, fathers, mothers command. It says, you are my friends if you do whatsoever I command. He's pointing you directly to the Gospels. The Messiah is pointing you to the gospel specifically, that this is what you should be following, because he commands these are the things that you should be following. You should be following his teachings, his understandings, nothing else. If there is anything contrary to the understanding that's in the gospels, then the understanding has been twisted, or the writing of it has been mistranslated, because there is not one part of the Father's word that is a contradiction to any other part. So going on to verse 15, henceforth I call you not servants, so you are no longer servants. Now he's speaking specifically to a Jewish community. Okay, so he's talking about the Jews, but it also, because of the Gentiles or Christian believers are also now partakers in all this. So he's also talking to you as well. So henceforth I call you not servants, for the servant knows not what his Lord does. But I have called you friends, for all things that I have heard of my Father, which means he was taught by the Father. He was taught by the Creator of the world. Okay? And from those teachings, he taught. And I have made known unto you. For all things that I have heard of my Father, the Old Testament is everything that we know about the Creator. Everything he taught, everything he wanted us to know, from the beginning of creation all the way up until the Messiah's birth. All the prophecies and everything. These are all the things that the Father taught him. And where did he gain all that information? Well, he gained it in spirit through the Father's word, the bread of life. Okay? So he understood the Old Testament. And he taught from the Old Testament. This is what he's saying. I have made known unto you. So all the Old Testament understandings that he's been taught by the Father in spirit, he is now teaching to the disciples. I have made all the things that I have learned from the Father, and I'm passing it on to you. Okay, and verse 16, you have not chosen me, but I have chosen you and ordained you that you should go and bring forth fruit. Okay, now the wording in this verse 16, ordained or appointed or anointed, one who is consecrated to do something, or one who has been appointed into an office. Okay, so he's stating that you didn't choose me. Okay, you didn't come trying to find me. If that's the case, then you would have found him in the Old Testament, which all the Father's word is inspired by the Spirit, and every word refers to back to the Messiah. Every word. There is not one word that I have not broken down so far in any way, shape, or form that has not come back to the understanding of the Messiah. Even from the beginning of Genesis, in the beginning, that also refers back to the Messiah, because he was in the beginning, as he talks about. Okay, and even as John talks about. So, going on, and but I have chosen you. Okay, we didn't choose him because we didn't obey. We were all rebellious. He chose us regardless of our rebellion, and ordained you, or appointed you, or consecrated you to do a work, that you should go bring forth fruit. Okay, you cannot bring forth fruit if you are cutting off the roots, which is the understanding of his teaching that he's gained from the understanding of the Father's teaching in the Old Testament. And that your fruit should remain, that whatsoever you will ask of the Father in my name, he may give it to you. In these things I command you, that you love one another. Okay. So now that we've gone through John chapter 15, verse 2, it goes and starts talking about, and thou being a wild olive tree. It tells us to go to Acts chapter 2. Now, I do know that there are many upon many other connection verses that we could look at, but for time's sake, I'm trying to make this as short as possible and as straight to the point as I possibly can, without destroying the full understanding of the Father's word. So Acts chapter 2, verse 39. And it says, for the promise is unto you and to your children and to all that are afar off, even as many as the Lord our God will call. So who's God? This is Peter speaking. Whose God did he say God belongs to? He says, many as the Lord our God shall call. Now, in this verse, in chapter 2, it is during Pentecost. So he's talking specifically to a mixed group of people, okay? Jewish, or Jewish and Gentile and so on and so forth. So he's talking to all these different mixed groups. So even as many as the Lord our God shall call. So he's not just claiming that our God being the God of Israel and is only the God of Israel. He's claiming in also this part that our God, the God of Israel, is also the God of the world. Okay? So, for the promise is unto you and to your children. Okay? The promise of redemption, the promise of salvation is not just to you specifically. It's also to you and your children and to all that are afar off. Okay? Speaking that Peter understood the Great Commission, that he was to go into all the world, just as the rest of the other 11 disciples at the time were called and commissioned to go into all the rest of the world and preach the gospel and baptize and save. That was the Messiah's goal for them. And in this part where Peter is talking to not just Jews but also Gentiles alike, he is doing exactly what he was called to do by bringing salvation to all the nations. Okay? So, then it also tells us to go to Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12. Now, I do not have all these looked up. We're going through this study right now in real time. Okay? I don't have any of this pulled up. I don't have any of this memorized. I don't have any of this written down, even though I have done this study, I think 3 or 4 times, and I have a whole bunch of notebooks to prove it. So Ephesians 2, verse 12, and it says that at that time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel. So he's talking about the wild olive tree, that you were aliens, okay, that you were without the Messiah, and strangers from the covenants of promise, okay? You are strangers in God's land. You are aliens in God's land. You are aliens to the commonwealth of Israel. You are strangers. and you have been aliens and strangers from the covenant of promise, which is the promises that were given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All the promises, not just the ones that we choose to understand, not just the land flowing with milk and honey that is promised. There are other things that are promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to our forefathers. Because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob also partake of those promises that were given to their fathers. So we are partakers of all the promises of God in the Old Testament. Having no hope, meaning you didn't have any hope until you were saved. And without God in the world, you didn't even know who God was. He chose you. So you are tied in now to all the covenants of promise that are spoken to or spoken about in the Old Testament. And to be tied to and no longer strangers or aliens to it, and you are partakers of the promises of those covenants, then it means you also have to partake in those covenants. Because it states in the Old Testament that if you break those covenants, you no longer have a promise in those covenants. You cannot have a promise of a covenant if you do not abide in the covenant in which you gain that promise from. Like I said, I'm trying to keep this short, and I'm trying to keep it straight to the point. So, going back to Romans 11, and let's see what else we can glean as the Father allows to be able to let us understand what's taking place in these verses. So we're going to go ahead and go on to verse 18. And it says, boast not against the branches. Okay. And that tells us to go to 1 Corinthians 10:12. So we're going to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. And it says, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. So wherefore let him that thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. If you think that you are higher, or your understanding is greater, or the understanding that has been taught to you is not fallible, is not wrong, and you think yourself that you stand upon something that is legitimate, that has a sure foundation, take heed lest you fall. The only foundation that we should be building on is the foundations that are written within the Father's word specifically, not the foundations that are spoken to by men. Because they are not the sure foundation. They do not make up the chief cornerstone in which the foundation is set. This is why it talks about that we need to test all things, to find out whether or not whatever anybody is speaking is the truth or not. To search his word. If you don't understand, you should be able to read from my expressions and the way that I'm speaking that I'm extremely fed up. I am extremely fed up. I hurt mentally, emotionally, and spiritually every single day because of things like this. Because the understanding is so wrong according to what the Father's word actually says that has destroyed the foundations of what we actually are supposed to be building upon. So, going on, well, because of unbelief, this is verse 20 in Romans chapter 11. Well, because of unbelief, they were broken off, and you stand by faith. Be not high minded, but fear. So, verse 20, it says that unbelief, they were broken off. So, it tells us to go to Hebrews 3:19. So, we're going to go to Hebrews 3:19, and we're going to see what Hebrews 3:19 says. Now, I do understand that this study is going to take a little bit. So we're going to be doing this in parts. And I'm going to cut this video short here in just a little bit, because I need to regather myself. Because just even going over this is hurting. So, Hebrews 3, chapter 3, verse 19. And it states, when it's talking about unbelief, they were broken off. So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. Okay? They could not enter into the promises. They could not enter into the new covenant because of their unbelief. This is talking about the Jews. Okay? Or any of those who choose not to believe that the Messiah is the Messiah, that he came, that he died for them, and through him, all mankind can be saved. Now, I've also spoken many times that I'm not a Christian. I'm not a Christian because of the simple fact of the understanding that Christians have, because of what they've been taught, which is wrong, which is why these videos are going to be done, to set the record straight, to testify to what the truth actually is. It's not written in the hearts of men. It did not come from men. It came from God. It comes from his word. It comes from the spirit of his word. And the spirit of his word is deep within many layers of his word. And if you are not studying it, and if you are not digging deep into it, then you're missing out on a whole new richness that you will never even know. This is why you have to abide in the roots. So, I'm going to go ahead and finish this part. But what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to go back to those connection verses, and we're going to dig deeper down in those connection verses to see further what it's actually talking about. Okay? Because there are still things that I've talked about that still need to be found out. Like that, you being strangers and aliens and so on and so forth are still partakers of the Old Testament and all the laws and so on and so forth, just as a Jew is. And then you want to say, no, 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 all that's done away. We're going to go through all that. We're going to fix this by the Father's word only. And all the understanding that I've talked about and you don't think is biblical, we're going to go through all that understanding that I've spoken about and pull it out of the Father's word. because that's where all this understanding comes from. So, uh, going on to, let's say, verse 22, what does it talk about? It says, "Behold, therefore the goodness and severity of God on them which fell, severity, but towards you, goodness, if you continue in his goodness. Otherwise, thou will also be cut off," or you will also be cut off. So, 22a, it says, "If you continue in his goodness." So 22a says, it tells us to go to 1 Corinthians 15. So 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 2. So 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 2. And it should be talking about if you continue in his goodness. Okay, it says, "By which also you are saved, if you keep in memory what I preached unto you, unless you have believed in vain." So now Paul is talking about what he's learned, and what he's learned, he is now preaching it to the world. So, by which also you are saved, talking about in the passage before, "Moreover, brethren, I declare unto you the gospel." So he's saying, what saves you? The gospel, which I preached unto you. If Paul preaches the gospel and our understanding of what he's saying is in opposition or contrary to any part of what the gospel talks about, then it's not Paul's writing that's wrong. It's the understanding of his writing that is wrong. Because nothing can be contrary to the gospels. Just like the gospels cannot be contrary to the Old Testament, or the Old Testament to the New Testament, and so on and so forth. It all works together as one. It's one spirit. So it says, "Which I preached to you, which also you have received, and wherein you stand, by which also you are saved." So you are saved by the gospel, and you now stand, you have received it, and you now stand in it. But are you? If you keep in memory, meaning in remembrance of the gospels, that in all other parts of the rest of the Bible that you read into or you study, you must always refer back to the gospels and remember what the gospels are saying to find out what the facts are. "What I have preached unto you." So he's saying that he's preaching from the gospels. He's preaching from Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Okay, now according to this, those books were not completely created at the time. They were still being made. But he's gathered the information from the Old Testament and from the Spirit, which led him into the understandings of the Gospels. "What have I preached unto you, unless you have believed in vain." Okay. So if you abide in those, in the gospel, then you're good. But if you believe those things in vain, then it means that you're not going to abide by it. You're not going to follow it. You're only going to take parts of it, parts that you want to understand, parts that you feel like you want to do, and so on and so forth. And therefore you believe in vain, because you do not practice the word. You only listen to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and stop right there. And we'll pick up on the next video called "Breaking Down the Walls," part 2, grafting in. And that's what the videos will be called. I want you to understand this, more than anything. The Father, the Messiah, wants you to understand this more than anything of how this all works. That he has not done away with anything until he creates a new heavens and new earth. Then he will do away with everything that is wrong, everything that is old, everything that is not natural to his character or natural to who he is. Everything that is in opposition to who he is. Then everything will be done away. And then everything else, everything that has been done away will be created new. Okay? Regardless of how we feel about these things, we need to listen. We need to be able to, I'm not asking you to accept this information, but I am asking you to listen, to open up your ears and really listen to the things that are being said. Really listen to what the Father's word is actually saying. He wants to enrich your heart. He wants to enrich your lives. He wants to make sure that you thrive. He plans nothing but goodness for you. Regardless, like I told you before, I don't correct you. I don't speak out against Christianity because of their understandings and their practices, because of nothing. I speak out against them because the Father speaks out against them. And I do my Father's will. That is my job as a minister, to correct and exhort and lift up you to the Father, to make sure that you are living rightly by his eyes and his eyes alone. Not by our own personal eyes, not by the eyes of others, but to live a life separated unto him. Because you belong to him. You are his child. You are his beloved. And he expects so much from you. And I believe it's about time that we start actually living up to those expectations. Regardless, Yah bless and keep you always. I love you. And may the countenance of the Father's face shine upon you always. Amen.